Welcome to a deep dive into a topic that feels, well, incredibly relevant right now. We're digging into a stack of notes and reflections sent in by one of you, all focused on two words we often hear together, maybe even use interchangeably: morality and ethics.
Right. And these sources, they give us a lot to think about. They push us beyond just simple definitions to look at the dynamic between these two concepts, how they shape what we think is right and wrong, just and unjust. Understanding them can really offer some clarity, I think, in a world that often feels so sharply divided.
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack these distinct forces, explore where they come from, how they apply, and see what the notes suggest about holding strong values while staying open and being open-minded without becoming, wishy-washy. Let's unpack this. So dipping into the material right at the start, what's the fundamental difference laid out here?
Okay. The core distinction the notes highlight is this. Morality is often described as personal, deeply cultural, and really rooted in emotion. It's that internal feeling, right? That sense of conscience or even guilt. Its sources are typically things like your upbringing, your religious background, maybe family tradition, or the norms of your community. This is where you might get that feeling of something being absolutely right or wrong. Killing is always wrong, that kind of thing. Or perhaps more relative beliefs, depending on your group.
Okay, so it's like your personal internal compass, yeah. Heavily influenced by your background and feelings. What about ethics, then? How does that compare in the material?
The notes frame ethics differently. This is presented as more of a structured, systematic way of thinking, reasoning about right and wrong. It's particularly used in complex situations or like professional settings. Think of it as more externalized, based on codified rules or frameworks, often drawn from philosophy, law, or specific institutional codes, medical ethics, legal ethics, that sort of thing. It tends to be more situational, more pragmatic. It involves weighing different factors like potential harms, duties, consequences
Yeah.
in a given situation.
All right, so if morality is that internal compass,
Yeah.
ethics is maybe more like the detailed navigation system you use for tricky terrain or when working within specific rules.
That analogy works really well, according to what these notes explore.
Yeah. Now, the
Yeah.
sources also point out where they overlap. I mean, they both deal with human behavior, guiding conduct.
Right.
They involve judgment, and they can definitely put you in a bind when they conflict with self-interest. They both rely on principles, values, norms, shaping how people act.
Exactly. They share common ground in their purpose, absolutely.
Huh.
But the differences in their foundation and application are key. The notes emphasize that while morality springs from personal belief or societal norms, ethics is grounded more in philosophical reasoning or these established professional standards.
And that gets into flexibility, doesn't it?
It does. Morality is often portrayed as, well, rigid or very deeply ingrained, whereas ethics is typically seen as more contextual, maybe adaptable, analytical. You apply morality to broad life choices, perhaps, but ethics really comes into play in specific areas: practicing medicine, running a business, practicing law.
And who are you answering to? That seems different too.
Yeah, good point. With morality, you're primarily accountable to yourself, maybe your immediate community. But the notes suggest with ethics, you're accountable to a code, a specific law, or your profession's standards. The language often differs too, right? Morality might use terms like good versus evil, while ethics tends towards right versus wrong or just versus unjust.
Let's look at some examples from the sources. They really bring this distinction to life. Lying is a classic one.
Ah, yes. The material contrasts a purely moral view, which might be a simple, absolute lying is always wrong, full stop. But an ethical perspective, however, could involve considering the situation. Is lying ever permissible if it prevents a greater harm? For instance, lying to protect someone from immediate danger. It's about weighing consequences and duties within a specific context.
That highlights the difference really clearly. How about something like euthanasia? That's complex.
Very complex. One moral view mentioned in the notes might ask you it's fundamentally wrong because life is sacred
Yeah.
and absolute, but the notes suggest a bioethical view would approach it differently, perhaps focusing on respecting patient autonomy and the ethical justification of relieving suffering in certain very specific circumstances. It shifts the focus from a moral absolute to a complex ethical analysis involving patient rights and the medical context.
And whistleblowing, that feels like it could come from a really powerful internal drive. Like you have to speak out.
It often does, yeah. A strong moral conviction might compel someone to reveal wrongdoing, feeling they must tell the truth, regardless of the personal cost. The notes contrast this with an ethical framework within a company, which might have a code specifically designed to protect whistleblowers. See, this isn't just a personal feeling, it's a systemic ethical mechanism, built into the rules to ensure accountability and safeguard the public. The sources also explore the origins of these ideas from a philosophical standpoint. They touch on normative ethics and metaethics as fields that study where our moral intuitions even come from. Ethics, in this view, is the more applied side, using specific frameworks to navigate real-world problems.
Right, like building that navigation system we talked about. And the notes mention frameworks like deontology, focused on duties and rules,
Right.
utilitarianism, which looks
Hmm.
at outcomes and consequences,
Mhm.
and virtue ethics, which centers on character, like what a virtuous person would do. These sound like different tools for the ethical toolkit. Exactly. Different lenses for analysis, different tools. Spot on. And going back to our compass and navigation analogy, the sources note that you could follow the navigation system, act ethically according to a code,
Yeah.
and still feel that internal moral guilt if it clashes with your personal compass.
Oh, absolutely. Or you could act purely on your moral compass, maybe revealing information you promised to keep secret, feeling you did the right thing personally,
Mm-hmm.
but you've acted unethically according to a professional code of confidentiality. The notes point out these systems can definitely be in tension.
Yeah, big time. And when we look at the scope, the material suggests ethics tends to function as a more generalizable framework. It aims for principles that can apply across different cultures or professions. Think about medical ethics or human rights ethics. They seek standards that can translate globally, using logic, consistency. It's that attempt at universal applicability, the toolkit that ideally anyone can use.
But morality is more embedded,
Yeah.
deeply shaped by specific religions, unique upbringings, regional norms, that personal conscience. Precisely. And because it's so tied to those specific roots, it can vary dramatically. What one culture feels is morally wrong, say, premarital relationships, another might see as perfectly acceptable. It's often tied to powerful feelings like shame, honor, guilt.
And they aren't static, they interact. The notes show examples where ethical reasoning can challenge established moral norms.
Yeah, like using ethical arguments against slavery when cultures had built a moral justification for it.
Exactly. But personal morality can also lead an individual to reject an ethical code if it just feels deeply wrong to them. It's definitely not a simple one-way street.
None at all. The material offers a powerful analogy to summarize this difference, actually. Ethics is like a court of law relying on logic, reasoning, principles of fairness to ask, is this action justifiable? Morality, on the other hand, is more like an inner voice, or maybe a community elder, drawing on culture, emotion, upbringing to ask, do I feel this is right or wrong?
This brings us to a really important part of the notes, how this distinction helps us navigate contentious issues. The material goes into some political and religious examples, and it's vital to remember, for you listening, that we are presenting what the source material says about these issues, not endorsing any particular viewpoint ourselves. We're just unpacking the notes.
Absolutely crucial point, yeah. Looking at issues like abortion, the material presents the common moral views. Typically, a pro-life stance rooted in the belief that life begins at conception and it's morally wrong to end it, versus a pro-choice stance emphasizing bodily autonomy as a moral right and the well-being of the pregnant person. Those are the moral framings presented.
And how does the material describe the ethical view on this? Is it different?
It shifts the focus, yes. Bioethics, for instance, evaluates things like fetal viability, patient consent, medical risks, harm reduction for all involved parties. It focuses on rights, autonomy, consequences, the broader social implications, which is distinct from the fundamental moral claims about when life begins.
Okay, what about capital punishment? Another really tough one.
Morally, the notes present differing views. Some see it as a form of justice, perhaps aligning with an eye for an eye. Others feel it's morally wrong, seeing it as revenge, arguing two wrongs don't make a right. Ethically, the material describes the debate being framed by different principles, like utilitarianism, is it an effective deterrent, does it save lives, versus deontology, is the state ever justified in taking a life, regardless of consequences. It also considers systemic issues, potential bias in the justice system, the risk of wrongful convictions, is the punishment proportionate?
Right. Shifting to issues often tied to religious views, the notes mention LGBTQ+ rights.
Here, the material contrasts a more conservative moral view, which might consider non-heterosexual relationships sinful based on religious tradition, with a more progressive moral view that embraces love, identity, and dignity as moral goods. The ethical perspective discussed in the notes emphasizes principles like justice, autonomy, consent, and non-maleficence, the idea to do no harm. It focuses on upholding rights and preventing harm, regardless of differing private moral beliefs.
And issues like blasphemy or apostasy, leaving or mocking a religion.
Morally, in some countries detailed in the notes, that's seen as deeply immoral, shameful. In others, questioning religion might be viewed through a different moral lens, perhaps seen as brave or virtuous. Ethically, the source material highlights the principle of freedom of thought and expression, defending the right to dissent or change one's beliefs, even when that deeply offends traditional moral norms. It's about protecting the right itself, distinct from the moral judgment of the act. The sources also get into some fascinating psychological and sociological perspectives. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt is mentioned with the argument that our morality is often very intuitive. We feel something is right or wrong first.
The gut reaction.
Exactly, the gut reaction. And then we come up with reasons to justify it. This connects to the idea of fast emotional system 1 thinking versus slower rational system 2 thinking. Ethics, in this view, is often that conscious system 2 effort to analyze and evaluate our moral gut reactions.
So our immediate gut feeling is often driven by morality, and ethics is the more deliberate, rational work we do on top of that. Is that the idea?
It's one way the notes frame it, yeah. They also point out that people often adopt moral views because those views reinforce their identity. I'm a good person-parent member of this group, therefore I believe X and do Y. Ethics, however, might ask you to step outside that identity and consider abstract principles, which can be surprisingly challenging for people. Sociologically, the material brings up Emile Durkheim's view of morality as essential social glue. It binds groups together. Shared values defining us versus them through codes of honor, purity, or even in modern context, phenomena like cancel culture.
Morality building tribes, then?
Precisely. And the note suggests that ethics often emerges as societies become more diverse and complex, requiring more formal institutional frameworks to navigate conflicting moral systems. The sociology angle also examines power, who gets to define what's considered ethical. That's a key question.
Okay, thinking about these deep roots and how they function, the sources ask a fundamental question. Why do we even seek out morality or ethics in the first place? What are the motivations here?
Well, the notes propose that morality offers things like a sense of belonging, security within a group, maybe comforting certainty, and even social status, feeling you're on the good side. Ethics, on the other hand, offers clarity when faced with complexity, a potential path towards justice that applies across different groups, mechanisms for accountability, and the possibility for growth, the idea that we can revise what we consider right as we learn and understand more. This connects directly to the discussion on tribalism in the notes. They pose a question. Is it like empowering to feel morally superior to others? Psychologically, the material suggests it can be quite potent, yeah? Offering that feeling of righteous certainty, even rage sometimes. It strengthens group bonds, creates clear villains and heroes.
Which, of course, has some pretty significant downsides, right?
Huge downsides. It can lead to echo chambers where different ideas just can't penetrate, dehumanization of those with different views, and ultimately stalled or impossible dialogue. The sources discuss whether this tribalism is inherently good or bad, suggesting it's variable. It can be a powerful force for good when protecting vulnerable groups, like in civil rights movements, but devastatingly bad when it leads to scapegoating, conflict, or violence. It's often a mixed bag, even in activism.
And in our interconnected, globalized world, navigating this tribalism is a huge challenge. The notes explore this, asking whether we should prioritize empathy or confrontation demolition, as they put it, when we encounter opposing moral views.
Right. The material argues that both approaches have their place depending on the context, but finding a balance is crucial. Empathy is suggested as valuable when someone's differing view seems sincere but perhaps misinformed, though there's a risk there of accidentally validating harmful ideas. Confrontation or demolition is presented as necessary when views are actively dehumanizing, endangering others, or causing harm, though the risk here is alienating anyone who might otherwise be an ally. It's tricky.
So what's a more productive alternative suggested in the notes? How do we handle this better?
The framework proposed is empathize with the person, challenge the idea. This approach aims to preserve dignity in the interaction without enabling harmful beliefs. It seeks dialogue without surrendering your own principles and aims for the possibility of change without resorting to conflict. The notes summarize this section with a powerful, concise takeaway. Morality is emotional, driven by identity, often tribal. Ethics is rational, analytical, and seeks principles that can cross cultural divides. To navigate our complex world, understand the deep roots of morality, apply ethical reasoning, and engage with people with empathy while standing firm against harmful ideologies.
This leads us right into a really practical section from the sources. When do you challenge someone else's view, and when is it better to simply listen and try to understand? They offer a framework for discerning that.
Yes, the notes outline several factors to consider: the context of the interaction, the other person's apparent intent, the power dynamics at play, the potential for harm, and importantly, your own readiness.
Okay, break that down a bit.
For example, the material suggests favoring listening in a private, personal conversation, especially early in a dialogue. Or if it seems the person is genuinely processing or exploring a belief. You might favor challenging in a public space, or when staying silent could be seen as endorsing a harmful view, or when others might be negatively influenced.
Makes sense. What about intent?
Consider their intent. Favor listening if they seem genuinely wrestling with a difficult question or appear open to different ideas. Favor challenging if they are aggressively asserting harmful views as absolute truths with, like, zero openness to discussion.
And power dynamics.
Crucial. The notes suggest favoring listening if the other person is in a vulnerable or marginalized position. Favor challenging if they're in a position of authority or using a platform to spread harm.
And the potential harm itself.
Absolutely key. Favor listening if the belief seems internal or self-contained and doesn't directly impact others' well-being. Favor challenging immediately if the belief infringes on the rights, safety, or dignity of others. Racism, homophobia, things like that are given as clear examples.
Right. And finally, your own readiness.
Yeah, don't forget yourself. Favor listening if you are feeling emotionally regulated, calm, and genuinely capable of empathy in that moment. Favor challenging if you feel grounded, resourced, and clear in your own moral stance, ready to stand firm under pressure. It takes energy. The notes also offer a practical, step-by-step pathway for engaging in these potentially difficult conversations, blending ethical principles with communication techniques and psychological awareness. It's a 5-step approach.
Okay, what are the steps?
First, they stress self-reflection. Before you even start, ask yourself honestly, why am I entering this conversation? Is it to understand them, to prove I'm right, to protect myself or others, or maybe even deep down to punish them?
Yeah.
Naming your own emotions helps you approach with genuine curiosity rather than immediately going into combat mode.
Good first step. What's next?
Second, lead with listening. Phrases like, tell me more about how you came to believe that, or what led you to that conclusion. This phase is about gathering information, understanding their perspective, building a tiny bit of trust. It can help you find nuance or potential points of connection.
Okay, listen first. Then?
Third, mirror. Then challenge. Once you think you understand, try mirroring back their position. So, if I'm hearing you right, you believe X because you've seen or experienced Y. Is that right? Getting them to agree you understand lowers their defenses. Then introduce a different perspective. Frame it as offering a different lens or something else to consider, not a direct contradiction. Phrases like, that makes sense in the context you described, and I wonder how that view sits with Z, or I used to think something similar and then I learned about, can be helpful.
Gentle challenge. What's step 4?
Fourth, differentiate the person from the belief. The notes emphasize separating someone's identity and worth from the idea they hold. You can say something like, you seem like a thoughtful person, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective. That's why I wanted to unpack this idea with you. Praise their willingness to engage. Critique the idea itself, not their character. This helps protect their dignity. This keeps them from shutting down.
Important distinction. And the last step.
Finally, know your boundaries. Not every conversation is going to work or reach a resolution. The notes are clear here. It's okay to draw a line. You can say, I can respect your right to believe that, as difficult as it is for me to hear, but I can't stay silent if that belief promotes harm to others. Sometimes staying silent is complicity. Sometimes a direct challenge is necessary disruption. And it's also okay, the material suggests, to walk away from a conversation or even limit ties if a belief is persistently harmful and there's no openness to reflection.
Right. The sources also highlight key guiding values for engaging in this kind of potentially challenging cross-moral dialogue: curiosity, compassion, clarity, discernment, and justice. They use a simple example. Someone says, AI-generated art is lazy and fake. A less helpful response might be immediate dismissal, like, you're just afraid of new things.
Yeah, shuts it down.
Exactly. A more curious response following this guidance would be, what is it specifically about AI art that worries you the most? An ethical challenge, blending empathy with principle. I understand that feeling of something being fake, but maybe we can think about how AI could also be a tool that amplifies human creativity.
Offers another perspective.
And setting a boundary could look like, I'm happy to hear your concerns, and if you're open to hearing my view on it, I'll share that too.
Nice. Diving even deeper, the notes offer some really nuanced points for self-reflection when you're trying to navigate these ethical and moral landscapes. One key point is recognizing the shadow of righteousness, right? Even when we think we're listening or being ethical, we might subtly crave being on the moral high ground. It feels good, right? It's validating, even seductive. But the notes warn that this craving for righteousness can actively block genuine empathy and prevent us from seeing nuance. It's important to check why you feel the need to be absolutely right in a given situation.
Oof, that's a tough but important thing to consider. What else is in this deeper section?
Another crucial point. People hold beliefs for deep emotional reasons, not just logical ones. Their views might be tied to their sense of belonging, serve as coping mechanisms, or they might genuinely fear losing their identity if they let go of a certain belief. Effective engagement, the sources suggest, requires emotional intelligence. Ask yourself, what might this person lose if they shifted their perspective? Approach them with the understanding that they might be feeling defended, rather than seeing them as simply defective or, wrong-headed.
Approach them as defended, not defective.
Yeah,
Real
yeah.
like that.
There's also the concept of epistemic humility, recognizing the inherent limits of your own moral lens. The sources remind us that your personal stance on right and wrong is filtered through your specific culture, personal history, maybe trauma, your social position. Even ethical frameworks, which aim for universality, are often built on specific philosophical traditions, many with Western roots. The notes suggest always leaving a little bit of room for the possibility, maybe I might be wrong about some aspect of this.
Humility. And internally, thinking about ourselves, the material points out we often have conflicting internal drives or subpersonalities.
Oh, yeah.
Part of you might crave absolute justice. Another part desperately wants connection and understanding. Maybe another part just wants to mock or dismiss someone who disagrees.
Totally.
It's helpful, the notes suggest, to pause and ask yourself, which part of me is reacting right now, and which part should be guiding my response in this situation?
Really useful self-awareness step. Finally, the sources touch on moral pluralism. Now, this isn't saying all moral views are equally valid, far from it. Instead, it's the recognition that some fundamental values genuinely conflict with each other. Think about the tension between absolute freedom and collective safety, for example.
Yeah.
Some conflicts in the world aren't neatly solvable. They can only be managed, often involving ongoing tension or uncomfortable compromises. It challenges the idea that there's always one single right answer everyone can agree on, pushing us to think about how we can navigate deep disagreements while still coexisting.
Right. The notes add a final thought here that ties it all together beautifully. Deep listening itself can be seen as an ethical practice. It shows respect, requires restraint from immediately formulating your counterargument.
Which is hard.
It is. And it allows for what the sources call ethical imagination, seeing the world just for a moment through the values and perspective of another person without immediately having to accept or reject it.
Listening deeply doesn't weaken your own convictions. The notes suggest it can actually sharpen them, tempered by a deeper understanding and potentially compassion.
So there you have it, a deep dive unpacking the listener's material, distinguishing morality, which we've seen is often that emotional, identity-driven kind of tribal compass from ethics, the more rational, analytical, and cross-cultural navigation system.
We explored how they overlap and differ, how they show up in contentious issues, the psychology and sociology behind them, and practical ways the notes suggest for engaging across divides. Not just to win arguments, but to truly navigate complex values with clarity, courage, and compassion.
It's really about stretching your understanding and connecting with others, even when you hold firm to your own truth. This journey through the sources leaves us with one final question from the notes for you to consider as you go about your day.
Can I learn from this person, even if I disagree with them?
Something to sit with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.